December 7th, 1941. The day that changed everything. Smoke rose over Pearl Harbor, battleships lay broken, and America had been sucker-punched into war. The Japanese Empire had struck with ruthless efficiency, and the world wondered, how would the United States respond? The answer came in the form of an audacious plan, one that would defy logic and redefine the limits of air power. The plan? Launch B-25 bombers, land-based aircraft, off an aircraft carrier and strike directly at the heart of Japan. It was impossible. It was insane. And that's why it had to be done. The United States needed a morale boost. The American people needed proof that Japan wasn't untouchable. Military leaders knew they couldn't match Japan's might in the Pacific. Not yet, but they could deliver a message. A strike at the very core of the empire, even if small, would be a wake-up call. And so, the pieces of the most daring air raid in history began to fall into place. Enter Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle, brilliant, fearless, and exactly the kind of leader needed for such a mission. A seasoned pilot, engineer, and strategist, Doolittle had the knowledge and guts to pull off the impossible. The plan was unprecedented. Load 16 B-25 bombers onto the USS Hornet, sailed deep into enemy waters, and launched them against Tokyo and other strategic targets. There was one problem. No one had ever launched bombers off a carrier before. The aircraft were too large, too heavy. If they failed to lift off, they'd plunge into the ocean. If they succeeded, they had no way of returning. But Doolittle's men, 80 hand-picked volunteers, weren't deterred. Through relentless training, modifications, and sheer determination, they made the impossible possible. They practiced takeoffs on dangerously short runways, learned how to lighten their aircraft by stripping them of excess equipment, and prepared for the reality that they were flying a one-way mission. Their only hope? Reaching China after the raid, where friendly forces might help them escape. The risk was enormous, but the mission was worth it. April 18th, 1942. The plan was already fragile, but disaster struck before the raid even began. The task force was spotted by a Japanese patrol boat, forcing an early launch, hundreds of miles further from Japan than planned. Fuel calculations were thrown into chaos. But turning back was not an option. The deck of the USS Hornet was barely long enough for a B-25 to gain the speed necessary to lift off. With the ship pitching in the waves, the first plane lined up. The crew held their breath. If Doolittle's lead bomber failed to take off, the entire mission was over. Engines roared. The bomber hurtled down the deck. The end of the carrier approached. Too fast. And then, just as disaster seemed certain, the aircraft lifted off, skimming above the ocean before climbing into the sky. The impossible had just been done. One by one, the remaining 15 bombers followed, each defying physics, risk, and fate. As they disappeared over the horizon, the men aboard the Hornet watched in awe. No one had ever done this before. No one knew if they'd ever see those planes, or those men, again. Hours later, the Japanese capital heard the unthinkable. Air raid sirens. The enemy was here. The B-25s roared over Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe, striking factories, military facilities, and infrastructure. The damage wasn't extensive, but it didn't have to be. The real target was psychological. The Japanese military had assured their people that their homeland was untouchable. That illusion was now shattered. Citizens panicked. Fires burned. The war had arrived on Japan's doorstep. The imperial military scrambled for a response, but it was too late. The American bombers had already slipped away, heading west toward what they hoped was safety. The raid was a success, but now came the hardest part: escaping alive. With fuel running low, the crews made for China. knowing they were flying blind into darkness, storms, and enemy-held territory. Many didn't make it. Some crash-landed in rice paddies, others bailed out over mountains. A few were captured by Japanese forces, facing brutal interrogations, imprisonment, and even execution. But thanks to the bravery of Chinese resistance fighters and civilians, many of Doolittle's men evaded capture, enduring incredible hardship to return home. They were hidden in villages, smuggled across enemy lines, and treated with immense kindness by people who risked everything to help them. The cost was high. Japan retaliated by massacring tens of thousands of Chinese civilians suspected of aiding the Americans. The escapees carried that weight with them forever. Doolittle himself believed the mission had been a failure. His aircraft had crashed. His men were scattered. He expected to be court-martialed upon his return. Instead, he was met with celebrations, parades, and the Congressional Medal of Honor. The raid had not only succeeded, it had changed everything. The Doolittle Raid didn't cripple Japan's military. It didn't turn the tide of the war overnight. But it did something just as important. It shattered Japanese confidence and electrified American morale. The Japanese military, humiliated and enraged, shifted its strategy. It diverted crucial forces to defend the homeland, stretching their empire thinner. The attack directly influenced Japan's next major move, their ill-fated attempt to crush the U.S. Navy at Midway. That battle, won by the Americans, marked the true turning point in the Pacific War. Against all odds, a handful of bombers had changed the course of history. Because sometimes a mission isn't about the damage it does. Sometimes it's about proving that the impossible can be done, and that when you knock America down, you'd better be ready for the punch that's coming next. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and most importantly, drop a comment below on what stories you'd like to hear about. This is VaultScape signing off.